We can only truly know a place if we experience what its people experience. We're going to build a hut. We'll join the Continental Army, and we will survive the winter at Valley Forge. The snow fell in heavy, lazy flakes drifting down onto the frozen ground like silent feathers. The wind howled through the leafless trees, bending their skeletal branches until they creaked in protest. It was December in Pennsylvania, and the world was a landscape of white, gray, and bitter cold. In a shallow valley along the Schuylkill River, a small city of crude wooden huts was taking shape. The huts were rough, no more than 12 by 16 feet, each hastily built from logs and sealed with mud that froze before it could dry. Inside, the air smelled of damp earth, unwashed wool, and the faint temps of smoke from small, struggling fires. The men who lived in them were not the professional soldiers of a mighty empire. They were farmers, blacksmiths, merchants, and fishermen who had laid down their plows and tools to pick up muskets. They called themselves the Continental Army, and they were starving. Only weeks before, these men had marched through Pennsylvania after a long season of defeats. Philadelphia, the seat of the Continental Congress, had fallen to the British in September. Washington's army had been driven from Brandywine, outmaneuvered at Germantown, and forced into a defensive retreat. The British wintered in relative comfort in Philadelphia, with warm quarters and supply lines to the sea. Washington's men, however, had no such luxury. Valley Forge was chosen not for comfort, but for strategy. Its high ground and access to the river made it defensible, and it was close enough to Philadelphia to keep an eye on British movements, while being far enough to avoid surprise attack. The choice of location was sound, but it came at a terrible human cost. By the time the army arrived in mid-December, supplies were already dangerously low. Many soldiers lacked shoes entirely. Bloody footprints trailed in the snow where bare feet had cracked and frozen. Their uniforms, already thin and patched, were soaked from rain and snow, then frozen stiff overnight. The huts they built were crowded, holding 12 men each. They slept on straw, sometimes without blankets, sharing body heat against the cold. Firewood was scarce, and the foraging parties often returned empty-handed. Food shortages were even worse. Meat was rare. Flour, when available, was coarse and full of grit from millstones. Many men subsisted on fire cake, a crude bread of flour and water baked over embers. Scurvy and dysentery spread quickly, and as January wore on, the men grew weaker. Washington knew he faced a crisis. He summoned Baron von Steuben, a veteran of the 7 Years' War, to drill his troops. But Steuben found the men so weak that drilling was impossible. A sudden death of disease was one thing to fight men. In this state would have been madness. Von Steuben persuaded Washington to order a complete halt to military operations until the men could recover. For 2 weeks, the Continental Army did nothing. Soldiers too weak to march were too weak to guard the camp, so Washington ordered them confined to their huts. Desertion rose sharply. As spring approached, the weather improved, but the army remained stuck in their huts. A thick blanket of ice covered the river, and the frozen ground offered little mercy to digging shovels. Washington hoped the siege guns the Congress had ordered in the fall would arrive soon. But in mid-February, word came from Philadelphia that the guns were not on their way. Washington threw himself on his horse and rode hard for Congress. He would demand action. As darkness fell, Washington reached New Philadelphia, now just another outpost in the British Empire. His counselors advised him to stay in warmer quarters, but he refused. He took a room at the King's Arms Tavern, where a roaring fire crackled in the hearth, and supper waited for him on a table. He washed his hands and face, then sat down to eat. But hunger was nothing compared to the sight that greeted him. On the table lay a letter from Benedict Arnold, freshly delivered from Valley Forge. It detailed the desperate state of his troops, the loss of men to cold and hunger, and his fear that the army would disintegrate before their mission. Washington read the letter, then pushed it away. He felt powerless. Unable to help his troops directly, he went to work on a plan. By the end of February, a steady stream of supplies flowed into Valley Forge. Food, clothing, medicines, and ammunition appeared almost out of nowhere, giving the army new life. In all, Congress supplied 13,000 barrels of flour, 26,000 pounds of meat, 4,000 gallons of rum, and 300 muskets. Even more important was the arrival of the Pennsylvania Kiska, an independent fighting force organized by John Hancock. Comprised of hunters and frontiersmen, the Kaskaskia brought with them skills in trapping and tracking, along with a huge haul of venison. Finally, on March 2, 1778, French alliance arrived with badly needed artillery and 2,000 well-armed troops. With supplies and allies in place, Washington began training his army anew. Under Steuben's guidance, drills became more intense. By April, though, even these preparations were not enough. The British were on the move. News arrived that General Howe had left Philadelphia and set out for New York. It was time to go. The army broke camp and marched out of Valley Forge, leaving behind the huts that had sheltered them through the winter. You probably know how the story ends. From the ashes of Valley Forge, George Washington and the Continental Army went on to win the Revolutionary War with help from France. But as we bring our own story to a close, we must remember that it wasn't easy. While we had moments of fun and excitement, there was a lot of cold, hunger, misery, and despair. Just ask anyone who served in the army, or anyone who has experienced severe food shortages. Hardships like these test the limits of human endurance. They also test the character of a nation. Our experience at Valley Forge reminds us that independence is precious, hard-won, and worth fighting for. Before we go, we need your help. The best way you can help us bring history to life for more people is by supporting us. Join our supporters today and get exclusive benefits like behind-the-scenes information, early access to videos, and the power to suggest future topics. You can find our support page below. Thank you for coming to Independencia. I'm your host. Remember, independence is hard-won and worth fighting for. See you next time. I'm the narrator. This is Valley Forge. A young nation is born. It's the middle of the night. Winds are howling. Snow is swirling. Temperatures are plummeting. Inside a tent, General George Washington stirs. Startled by a sudden crash, he sits up and looks around. Everything seems okay, but it's hard to say when your tent is swaying like a ship at sea. The wind is unrelenting. Washington pulls on his coat and ventures outside. All around him, the soldiers' huts are rocking and swaying. Some are already collapsing. It's been like this for days. And while the storm rages, Washington is racked with worry. On Christmas Day, 1777, George Washington had established his headquarters at Valley Forge, Pennsylvania, a sprawling tract of meadows and woods about 25 miles northwest of Philadelphia. Why did he choose this place? Because it was believed to be abandoned. But within weeks, the 2,000 or so men of the Continental Army found themselves exposed to the full fury of winter in a valley that was anything but deserted. Storms, flooding, disease, death, and desertion stalked the army. Even worse, food and supplies were critically low. In mid-January, Washington wrote to the Pennsylvania Council begging for flour, bread, meat, sugar, rum, vinegar, tents, blankets, shoes, stockings, shirts, overalls, and 1,000 other things. Winter here was not just cold, it was deadly. And we're going to spend the next few minutes exploring one of America's most pivotal turning points. Want more? Okay, let's get started. Though large and sturdier than a soldier's hut, Washington's tent was still cold. Rations were not much better. While soldiers ate mostly a thin porridge called a wash, the general enjoyed a bit more variety. On any given day, he might have breakfast of mush, eggs, and milk, perhaps with a bit of toast or bread and butter. Lunch might consist of roast or boiled beef with potatoes and carrots. Dinner might feature mutton, pork, or ham with turnips and cabbage. No matter the fare, meals lacked seasoning, fresh vegetables, and fruit. Meat was often tough and watery. Food historians have estimated that Washington probably consumed about 2,400 calories a day, roughly 2/3 the daily calorie intake recommended for an average adult male today. But while the quality of his diet may have been decent, Washington was rarely able to enjoy his meals in peace. Always present in his mind was the knowledge that an army was not just bodies with muskets, it was a living spirit. If that spirit broke, no amount of strategy could save the cause of independence. Desertion was already a problem, and the enlistments of many men would expire before spring. In his letters to Congress, Washington pleaded for supplies and clothing, warning that without relief, the army might simply dissolve. But Congress, itself, struggling to govern a young nation in the midst of war, proved unable to help. The states were slow to send aid, and the roads to Valley Forge were choked with snow and mud. Relief came, but always too little and too late. On February 1778, however, a man arrived at Valley Forge who would change the course of the war. He was a short, stocky man of 46 with iron-gray hair, a ruddy complexion, and piercing blue eyes. He carried himself with an air of confidence and authority. He also smelled strongly of stale waste and chamber pots, an unfortunate byproduct of travel in the 18th century. His name was Friedrich Wilhelm von Steuben. Like so much else about him, his name was a fraud. Born in Prussia, he was a veteran of numerous European wars, including the 7 Years' War, where he served under British commanders. He was a skilled soldier and drill master, but his real talents lay in deception. Though he claimed to be a nobleman who had renounced his Prussian title to fight for American liberty, he was, in reality, a commoner who had stolen his noble rank and his commission as an officer in the king's army. As it turned out, this unlikely hero wasn't even German. He was born to a family of modest means near Magdeburg, in what was then a minor duchy known as Saxony, quite far from Prussia, which is now northern Germany. He changed his name to von Steuben to sound more Prussian, and he later invented a story about his service in the British Army. In fact, he had deserted the British right before the outbreak of the Revolutionary War. Why? Probably because there was money to be made in America. Steuben, a naturalized citizen of Massachusetts, offered his services to the colonial government and was appointed a major general. But it soon became obvious that he lacked military experience, so he was dismissed from his post with the generous pension of a full general. Steuben wasted no time in reporting to General Washington. When the commander heard Steuben was an experienced drill master, he put the Prussian to work training recruits. But within weeks, Steuben realized that the army was in desperate shape. Morale was down, supply and logistics were in shambles, desertions were rampant, soldiers were raw recruits or poorly trained militia. He decided to take matters into his own hands. Before long, he was addressing troops across the entire camp. He spoke little English, relying on aides to translate his commands. But what he brought to the army was something they all understood: discipline. For Washington, Steuben's arrival was like finding a lost treasure. But life at Valley Forge was still harsh. In March, Washington wrote to the Secretary of War, "I am afraid we shall not see our enlistment accounts to any purpose unless Congress do us some extraordinary justice in granting us a proper quantity of clothing, for want of which we can do little and suffer much." The following month, he noted with sorrow that officers and soldiers died every day from cold and fatigue. Yet, a transformation was taking place, and in May, Washington wrote home, "The arrival of General von Steuben has given us an experienced officer to teach our troops the military art, and I have no doubt that in a little time we shall have a well-disciplined and complete army." By spring, Steuben's model company could load and fire their muskets with impressive speed, maneuver in tight formations, and execute battlefield commands with precision. Other units quickly followed suit. The winter of Valley Forge had tested the Continental Army to its breaking point. Soldiers had suffered greatly from cold, hunger, disease, and death. Yet they had endured. Now they were ready to go forward together. In June 1778, the soldiers left Valley Forge and marched south to meet the British at the Battle of Monmouth. There, they fought side by side. The hardships of Valley Forge had forged them into a cohesive unit, but the army was still not fully ready for prime time. Men still lacked proper clothing and equipment. And although they could march and maneuver as one, the training of individual soldiers remained uneven. Still, the army now possessed a vital quality: discipline. From this point forward, soldiers throughout the war would be tested again and again. Winter encampments would continue to plague the army. Supplies would continue to dwindle. Soldiers would endure hardship, privation, illness, and injury. But nothing would break them. They had learned the meaning of unity and endurance. In the crucible of Valley Forge, they had forged themselves into a formidable fighting force, and the British would learn soon enough that this army, though tested, was not done. The winter of 1777 to 78 has become known as the darkest winter of the Revolutionary War. But actually, it was not that cold. Temperatures never dropped below 0 degrees Fahrenheit, and in fact, precipitation and humidity kept the thermometer from plunging much below freezing. But what made the winter so hard was the wind, which tore through the valley, carrying moisture from the nearby Schuylkill River and creating a numbing, bone-chilling effect. Add to this heavy, wet snow that soaked through clothing and didn't freeze. sleet that froze on contact with skin, rain that turned to ice overnight, and you can see why. Soldiers struggled to stay warm. Valley Forge was a turning point in the war, but it was not a turning point for everyone. African Americans continued to serve in segregated units under white officers, but they were largely overlooked for promotions. Women continued to serve as nurses, cooks, laundresses, and spies, but they were generally denied positions of leadership. And that's our tour of Valley Forge. Did you learn something new? Let us know in the comments section below, and don't forget to subscribe. The burning of Washington's war continued with sporadic battles until finally, after years of bloodshed, it was over. When news of the treaty reached Washington, D.C., citizens gathered in the streets and fired cannons to celebrate. But the celebration turned to shock and horror as they realized that their beloved city was a smoldering ruin. It was one of the most humiliating defeats ever suffered by the young nation and remains one of the few times foreign power has attacked and successfully defended a capital city. So how did it happen? Let's find out in today's episode of Fire of Learning. The burning of Washington, D.C. was one of the final battles of the War of 1812 between the United States and Great Britain. By the summer of 1814, the war had become unpopular in the northern states, who felt that it was neither necessary nor beneficial. But the southern states, known as the War Hawks, strongly supported continuing the fight. This group consisted mainly of young, inexperienced politicians from the West and Southwest who wanted to expand American territory into British Canada and gain more land for slave states. The North, meanwhile, thought that war would only bring hardship and destruction, and preferred instead to continue peaceful trade with Britain. Unfortunately, there was no compromise, and so the country split into two factions, each eager to win the conflict. However, each side had differing views about where the war should be fought. The North preferred fighting at sea or in Canada, while the South demanded attacking and taking over British Florida. As both sides argued, military failures piled up. In the first major battle of the war, American forces invaded Canada, but their poorly trained militia units panicked at the sound of gunfire and fled, breaking their supply lines. And soon, the American commander, General William Hull, found himself trapped in Detroit with just 4,000 soldiers and no way to resupply them. When a British force of 2,000 regulars approached, he surrendered without firing a shot, causing outrage across America. As the year progressed, the U.S. suffered more defeats in Canada and the Northwest Territory. Meanwhile, American privateers captured many British merchant ships carrying valuable cargo. But now, Britain had begun impressing American sailors to help crew their ships. For Americans, this was a direct attack on their sovereignty and national pride. And when news of the impressment of American sailors reached the United States, war fever swept through the nation. The War Hawks called for revenge and demanded action against Britain. The United States declared war on June 18, 1812. President James Madison delivered his declaration of war to Congress, saying, "The war is to be conducted on principles of self-defense to vindicate our national honor and to secure to ourselves and our citizens the enjoyment of the rights which are our due as nations." A new threat note that the die was cast, both countries began mustering their armies. The United States had an army of only 7,000 men with outdated weapons and no navy to speak of. Although Congress authorized the building of new ships, none were completed in time. The British force in America consisted of 12,000 regular soldiers, mostly veterans from the Napoleonic Wars. Britain also had the best navy in the world. Madison knew that Britain would probably try to capture the American capital of Washington, D.C., and divert its attention away from the war in Europe. He ordered Major General Edmund Custis with 3,000 troops to protect the city. But Custis believed that his troops could easily be overwhelmed. He spent his time planning defenses for Baltimore, 200 miles away, and so Washington, D.C. was virtually undefended. On August 24, 1814, British naval forces arrived off the coast of the Patuxent River and landed 5,000 troops near the village of Benedict. Only one company of 80 soldiers was present to stop them. Realizing that the defense was hopeless, the commander ordered his men to retreat to Washington, D.C. News of the British landing spread like wildfire through the city. Citizens formed hastily assembled militias and raced to the capital to defend it. But the British were advancing quickly, marching toward the city at the head of 3,000 troops, with another 2,000 following close behind. As the British got closer, they sent word that if the city surrendered, its buildings and inhabitants would be spared. But since the leaders of the American militia were never notified of the message, fighting commenced. The first battle took place at Bladensburg, where 6,000 American militia faced the British. They fought bravely, but were hopelessly outnumbered. Within an hour, the British charged forward and sent them fleeing in disorder. The British then entered the capital, and soon every public building was ablaze. The British set fire to the Capitol, the White House, the Treasury, and several other government buildings. These fires burned throughout the night, sending thick black smoke into the sky, and the flames were visible for miles around. Amongst the people forced to flee were First Lady Dolly Madison and her 2 children. Her husband, President James Madison, was away at the time, and she had to organize her own escape. While her servants packed what belongings they could carry, she went to the home of a friend. Before leaving, she paused to save a valuable painting of George Washington, which had hung in the White House since 1801. She then escaped to safety with her friend and the portrait. During the next 4 days, British troops occupied the city, living off the food of the residents and destroying whatever they didn't eat. They looted homes and businesses, shot horses and livestock, and destroyed factories, barns, and fences. They even cut down and burned trees along the streets. In all, the British burned or destroyed approximately $17 million worth of property, equivalent to nearly $500 million today. Although the burning of Washington, D.C. was a great embarrassment to the United States, it actually had very little effect on the outcome of the war. A week later, American forces regrouped and won a decisive victory at the Battle of Baltimore, where British troops attempted to take Fort Henry. Part of the fort's defense was a new weapon called the bomb rocket, which was designed by a free black man named Daniel Weems. It consisted of a hollow tube filled with gunpowder attached to the end of a long wooden pole. One soldier could carry several of these rockets and launch them by hand. As the British approached the fort, Weems and his comrades loaded the rockets and waited. When the attackers came within range, they launched their projectiles, which exploded on impact and drove the British back. Though this battle was going on, another group of British soldiers was approaching Washington, D.C. to lay siege to it. But upon hearing of the defeat at Fort Henry, they retreated and sailed back to Britain. As the war continued and casualties mounted, the people of both countries grew weary. They wanted it to end, but neither was willing to make peace. Finally, in December 1814, a treaty was signed in Ghent, Belgium, ending the war. The terms of the treaty were very generous to the United States because Britain was distracted by the war in Europe and wanted to end hostilities so that it could focus its resources on Napoleon. The treaty stated that both countries would return all conquered territories to their original owners, and prisoners of war would be released. The issue of impressment was avoided, and the United States gained nothing from the war. Today, the legacy of the burning of Washington, D.C. continues to live on. The heroic story of Dolly Madison saving the portrait of George Washington inspired many works of art. The original painting hangs in the National Gallery of Art, and copies can be seen throughout the Capitol. Several streets are named after heroes of the war, such as General Stricker and Captain Thomas Truxtun. And the spot where the British landed their troops is marked by a monument. What do you think of the burning of Washington, D.C.? Do you think the United States was right to go to war with Britain? And why do you think the British decided to attack the Capitol? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please subscribe. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time. The year is 1812, and you are watching the all-new History Guy. After burning down the nation's capital, the British next turned their attention to Baltimore, a port city that teemed with activity. 30 miles away, Fort McHenry guarded the entrance to the harbor. At 2:30 a.m. on September 13, 1812, 3 British warships and 18 transports steamed into view. The Americans inside the fort exchanged pleasantries with the British captain, thinking that they might be about to make a new friend. But before long, the transport ships anchored and began unloading troops. Then the warships opened fire. Fort McHenry was being attacked. For the next 25 hours, the British bombarded the fort by noon the following day. More than 400 red-hot cannonballs had exploded against its ramparts. Throughout the night, the American defenders, just 400 or so of them, had kept up a constant return fire, inflicting heavy casualties on the British. By daybreak, the bombardment had finally ceased, and there it was. Flying above the fort, in the breeze, the large red and white striped American flag, a symbol of defiance that had endured the night. Watching the attack from the deck of a truce ship in the harbor was Francis Scott Key, a 35-year-old lawyer. He'd been aboard trying to negotiate the release of a friend who'd been captured by the British. Now he watched the British ship's retreat. In his mind raced thoughts of his wife and children. He wondered if he would ever see them again. As the smoke cleared and the sun rose, he noticed the flag still waving above Fort McHenry. The fort had survived, and in that moment, he scribbled some thoughts down on a piece of paper. Those thoughts became a poem that would be set to music, and later become the national anthem of the United States. In the early morning hours of January 1815, American soldiers were making their way through the streets of New Orleans. They were exhausted, hungry and thirsty, but they were moving in tight formation, their muskets primed for action. Their leader, General Andrew Jackson, called for a halt. Before him stretched the out-defenses, or rather the lack of defenses. There were some low earthworks and a few fallen logs, but nothing that could stop a full-fledged British assault. What the Americans lacked in fortifications, however, they made up for in numbers. On this day, they vastly outnumbered their enemy, and they weren't just regular soldiers. The general's force consisted of regular army soldiers, militia, frontiersmen, and even pirates led by Jean Lafitte. At 6:30 in the morning, buglers sounded the attack, and the Americans charged forward. The battle was over in less than an hour. But despite the victory, the United States was close to losing the war. Even as fighting raged in the West and along the Gulf Coast, the American public was clamoring for peace. And for good reason. Up to this point in the war, the United States had done little to show for its tremendous sacrifices. But the British had managed to burn down the Capitol building in Washington, D.C., and inflict several stinging defeats on American forces. In August 1814, when American forces fled Washington, they left behind the very thing the British desired most, the White House. They did not stop until they reached Baltimore, but there the city's defenses proved too strong. Back in New Orleans, the war was also beginning to wear on people's nerves. When the British took Fort Bowyer in August 1814, killing or capturing almost everyone inside, residents knew that their city was next. So they did something drastic. They elected Andrew Jackson mayor and put him in charge of defending the city. That meant that he was responsible for raising an army. But how could he do that? He didn't want to leave his post, and he wasn't exactly popular among the locals. But then he had a stroke of luck. A group of pirates arrived offering their services. It was a motley crew indeed. There were regular soldiers, militia, frontiersmen, and even pirates. But under Jackson's steady leadership, they formed an effective fighting force. And on New Year's Day, 1815, they defeated the British. Though the Battle of New Orleans effectively ended the war, the treaty that ended it didn't take effect for another 3 months. You see, the news just took a long time to travel across the Atlantic Ocean. The Treaty of Ghent, signed on Christmas Eve 1814, restored the pre-war boundaries, which meant that no territory changed hands. It also stipulated that neither country would be able to annex any Northwest Territory tribes that had sided with the British. And though these provisions were written into the treaty, the British actually had a hard time leaving. Many of their troops were stuck in areas where they'd been stationed, like present-day Texas, because the roads back east were impassable, and those that were able to return home didn't do so right away. They often stayed in Canada because they didn't want to start a fight with the Americans. So the war continued without any real purpose. In fact, on March 2, 1815, a peace conference was held between U.S. and British officials in the town of Gonville. Today, the two countries couldn't even agree on how to spell the name of the treaty that ended the war. The Americans call it the Treaty of Ghent, while the British refer to it as the Treaty of 24. But we will probably never know why. As time went on, the situation became increasingly awkward. Forts were abandoned, troops demobilized, and entire supply depots were given to local citizens. In April 1815, British Major Robert Ross wrote, "Our business here is virtually done, but we are like an old bachelor who has the keys of the cupboard, and woe, unturn them over." His prediction was spot on. For years after the signing of the treaty, American and British troops remained stationed in the Northwest Territory. They were supposed to leave immediately after the treaty went into effect, but they didn't. Things didn't really get back to normal until 1819, when all remaining British troops left Fort Niagara. The War of 1812 was a strange war. It had a bad start, an uncertain middle, and a somewhat anticlimactic end. But during the 1820s and 30s, people began to look back on it more fondly. Part of that was because of the national anthem, though it wouldn't become official for another 75 years. But another reason was that the war helped foster a new sense of national unity. The author Washington Irving described it best when he said, "It is a truth that our war with England has been a blessing in disguise. It has given a healthy and a vigorous tone to the national character. It has made us look and think and act as a nation." Even so, the war wasn't all sunshine and rainbows. It was bitter and brutal, not just for the Americans. In the end, thousands of lives were lost and countless homes and businesses were destroyed. The biggest casualty, however, was the native population. Thousands upon thousands of Native Americans died of disease and starvation during the conflict. Others were forced to flee their homes or move to reservations. The combined effect of the war and decades of American expansion had broken Native resistance in the Northwest Territory, which was one of the goals of the war. As you can probably tell, the War of 1812 is a complicated topic. Some historians say it was a conflict without a purpose. Others say it was a necessary defense against British imperialism. Maybe the truth lies somewhere in between. All we know for sure is that it ended in a stalemate, but it left an enduring legacy on the young United States. It showed that the nation could stand against one of the world's greatest powers and endure. If you want to learn more about the War of 1812, check out the additional resources. Also, don't forget to subscribe so you never miss an all-new episode. I'll see you next time. By the mid-1840s, the United States was a nation on the move. Westward, the idea of manifest destiny, the belief that America was destined to expand from the Atlantic to the Pacific, gripped the national imagination. In 1845, the U.S. annexed Texas, a former Mexican territory that had won independence a decade earlier. Mexico, still viewing Texas as its own, broke diplomatic ties. Tensions escalated quickly. President James K. Polk, an ardent expansionist, sent troops under General Zachary Taylor to the disputed border between Texas and Mexico along the Rio Grande. In April 1846, Mexican cavalry attacked an American patrol, killing or wounding several. To Polk, this was the spark he had been waiting for. On May 13, 1846, Congress declared war. Today, we're going to see how the United States went to war with Mexico. Why did the U.S. go to war with Mexico? Well, it wasn't one single thing. The annexation of Texas was the last straw. For decades before Texas was annexed by the U.S., it was a part of Mexico. But ever since Mexico gained independence from Spain in 1821, it struggled to maintain control over the unruly province. Mexico offered land to Americans if they would come and settle there, hoping they could help develop the region, and thousands of Americans took up the offer. But the problem was, those American settlers didn't always follow Mexican rules. They chafed under the authority of the central government in Mexico City, and many wanted Texas to break away from Mexico altogether. When they did break away, Mexico still saw Texas as their territory, while the United States, well, they saw Texas as their new territory. And once the United States annexed Texas, that caused a big rift in relations with Mexico. President James K. Polk was known as Young Hickory. He was also a very aggressive expansionist. So when Polk sent troops into what Mexico considered to be their country, that was bound to cause problems. There was also a dispute over the border between Texas and Mexico. Texas claimed the border was here at the Nueces River, but Mexico claimed the border was here at the Rio Grande. So when Polk sent troops under General Zachary Taylor to the disputed area, that again heightened tensions with Mexico. And then came the incident that sparked the war. A group of American soldiers were traveling along the Rio Grande when they were attacked by Mexican cavalry. Several Americans were killed or wounded, and Polk used this as the casus belli, the reason for war, to declare war on Mexico. The war began in the spring of 1846. General Zachary Taylor's task was to protect American territory and also advance into Mexico. His first order of business was securing the borders. Taylor established two main camps, one at Fort Texas on the Rio Grande, the other at Point Isabel on the coast. Meanwhile, another American force under General Stephen Kearny advanced through New Mexico, which was also a part of the Mexican Empire. In April 1846, Taylor got word that a Mexican force was advancing on his left flank along the Rio Grande. Taylor immediately marched out to meet them. The first battle was at Palo Alto on May 1846. The Americans were able to beat back the Mexicans, but it was a close call, and Taylor decided to dig in and wait for reinforcements before pushing any further. The next day, Taylor's forces met the Mexicans again at Resaca de la Palma. Again, it was a close call, but Taylor's men were better organized and better trained, and they beat the Mexicans back across the Rio Grande. American victories like Palo Alto and Resaca de la Palma demonstrated the superiority of the U.S. Army over the Mexican Army. The siege of Monterrey was one of the most intense battles of the war. It involved heavy artillery and small arms fire. The Americans ultimately prevailed, but not without taking heavy casualties. The battle was notable for the participation of several future Civil War generals, including Ulysses S. Grant and Robert E. Lee. After the fall of Monterrey, Taylor's forces moved on to occupy Matamoros, which gave the U.S. control of northeastern Mexico. This phase of the war ended in December 1846, when Santa Anna was forced to retreat. Meanwhile, another American force under General Stephen Kearny captured New Mexico without much resistance. By early 1847, the United States had taken almost all of northern Mexico. But the real prize was Mexico City, located deep in central Mexico. Getting there, however, would be difficult. The U.S. needed a strong navy to protect its ships sailing around the tip of Mexico. So in March 1847, American naval forces under Commodore Matthew Perry established a naval base at Veracruz on Mexico's east coast. On March 9, 1847, the largest amphibious landing in U.S. history up to that point took place. American sailors and Marines landed and quickly drove the Mexicans back. Then they set about building defenses for the 6,000 soldiers who would soon arrive. The Army, under the command of General Winfield Scott, arrived in April and immediately set about marching toward Mexico City. Scott's army, known as the Army of the North, consisted of about 6,500 regular soldiers and 1,500 volunteers. It was made up of veterans from previous conflicts as well as many new recruits. The first major engagement came at Cerro Gordo on April 1847. The Americans defeated the Mexicans and captured two heavily fortified hills. Despite the victory, the campaign continued inland. On August 20, 1847, Scott's forces fought a major battle at Contreras and Churubusco. The engagements resulted in significant casualties on both sides. Despite fierce resistance, particularly at Churubusco, Scott's army managed to capture both towns. During the battle, a group of American soldiers led by future Confederate General Thomas Stonewall Jackson performed a daring reconnaissance mission behind enemy lines. Their report provided valuable intelligence that contributed to the overall American victory. The capture of Contreras and Churubusco brought Scott's army within 6 miles of Mexico City. The final push began with the assault on a series of fortifications known as the Defenses of Mexico. Despite heavy casualties, the Americans managed to breach the defenses. However, they faced fierce resistance as the Mexican army retreated into the city. On September 13, 1847, American forces attacked Chapultepec Castle, the seat of the Mexican emperor's power in Mexico. The castle was defended by a mix of professional soldiers and young Mexican cadets, known as Los Niños, or the Boy Heroes. Despite being outnumbered and facing superior weaponry, the Mexican cadets fought valiantly, repelling multiple attacks. However, the Americans eventually breached the castle walls. By the following day, American troops had entered Mexico City, effectively ending the war. Fighting continued sporadically for several months, but the war was essentially over. The Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, signed in February 1848, ceded vast territories to the United States. Mexico was forced to recognize the Rio Grande as the southern border of Texas. The United States paid Mexico $15 million for the newly acquired lands, which included present-day California, Nevada, Utah, most of Arizona, and New Mexico, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, Kansas, and Oklahoma. This massive territorial acquisition nearly doubled the size of the United States. The Mexican-American War had profound implications for both countries. For the United States, the war marked a significant step towards fulfilling the concept of manifest destiny. The acquisition of vast territories in the Southwest set the stage for future conflicts, including the Civil War. The war also saw the emergence of several prominent figures on the American side, including General Winfield Scott, whose strategy and leadership were instrumental in achieving victory. Additionally, the war had a profound impact on the development of the United States military, particularly through the experiences of officers who would later play key roles in the Civil War. For Mexico, the war was a devastating blow. The loss of significant territories, coupled with internal political turmoil, left the country in a state of instability for decades. The war's impact on Mexico's national identity and its territorial integrity would resonate for generations. The legacy of the Mexican-American War continues to be debated and discussed, particularly regarding issues of territorial rights, national identity, and the role of military intervention in foreign affairs. But now, I want to hear from you. What do you think? Was the Mexican-American War avoidable? Let me know your thoughts down below. Also, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss any new videos. The Mexican-American War had been over for 13 years, but for some Americans, its echoes still lingered. The war had been the first time that large numbers of Americans had taken up arms against each other, and for many, the experience had been brutal and disillusioning. General Zachary Taylor, who had led U.S. forces to victory in the war, had become a national hero, but others bore the invisible wounds of war, the kind that never quite healed. It had been a strange war, fought half a world away, but its effects had reverberated back home, raising new questions about the nature of American identity and purpose. In the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo signed in February 1848, Mexico had ceded vast territories to the United States, present-day California, Nevada, Utah, Arizona, and parts of Colorado, Wyoming, New Mexico, and Texas. The victory expanded the nation's borders dramatically, but it also deepened tensions over the spread of slavery. That issue had been temporarily put off, but now it was back. In the newly acquired territories, should slavery be allowed? Southerners argued that since the lands were theirs by right of conquest, they should be allowed to take their property there. The Mexican-American War had been fought over land that many Americans believed was rightfully theirs. If the United States could take land from Mexico, why couldn't individual Americans take land in the name of manifest destiny? Northern abolitionists, meanwhile, saw the war as an opportunity to keep slavery out of new territories. To them, the acquisition of new lands without the acquisition of more slaves was a godsend. As one New York abolitionist put it, "I wish we had annexed Texas 5 years ago. Now we have a chance to make it a free state." Tensions over slavery were high, higher than ever before, and while the nation debated the issue, another shadow loomed on the horizon. What if the war wasn't really over? Sometime between 1848 and 1861, the United States began to change. Historian Alan Brinkley writes that during those years, the nation went through an identity crisis, struggling to understand who Americans were and where the country was headed. Many Americans felt a growing disconnection from the ideals of the American Revolution. Yes, the United States was still a beacon of liberty for immigrants around the world. But what did freedom mean for Americans themselves? Was it a blessing to be cherished or a burden to be shed? In the decades after the Mexican-American War, many Americans began to feel the burden of freedom, especially African Americans. After the war, the United States controlled nearly all of the land between the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans. But for blacks, the vast majority of the country was off-limits. They remained trapped in the South. Although many risked everything to escape to freedom in the North or Canada, most lived under the brutal reality of slavery. But even in the South, there were signs of change. A small group of whites began to argue against slavery. At the same time, a sense of black pride was growing among some Southern slaves. By 1861, the United States was no longer the fragile experiment it had been in Washington's day, but it was also no longer united. The question of slavery, simmering for decades, had finally torn the nation apart. On December 20th, 1860, after Abraham Lincoln's election, 11 Southern states seceded from the Union and formed the Confederate States of America. They saw Lincoln as a threat to the institution of slavery and to their way of life. The North, under Lincoln's leadership, was determined to preserve the Union. On April 12, 1861, Confederate forces fired on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor. The fort surrendered 2 days later. The Civil War had begun. As news of the attack on the fort reached Washington, a group of men gathered in the White House to discuss the response. Among them was General Winfield Scott, a veteran of the War of 1812 and the Mexican-American War. He laid out a strategy for winning the war. First, he said, the Union needed to blockade the southern ports. Then, using the Navy, the Army would take control of the Mississippi River and split the Confederacy in half. Finally, the Union troops would march on Richmond and take the capital. The plan made sense, but it would take time. President Abraham Lincoln listened patiently, then replied, "Gentlemen, I think we must do all these things, but we must do them on Monday." That Monday became known as the day the Civil War began. Within weeks, thousands of Union troops were moving to war at the front lines. Their destination, the town of Manassas, Virginia, just 30 miles from Washington. For many soldiers, the Mexican-American War had been their first taste of combat. Some returned home as heroes, others as broken men. At the time, 18-year-old John Mosby had been too young to fight in the Mexican-American War. But when the Civil War began, he joined the Confederate Army as soon as he could. He and his fellow Virginians were confident that they would win easily. "We expected to whip them all the time," he recalled, "and we did for a time." Few people, however, expected the war to end quickly. Many young Americans who joined the war effort didn't realize how dangerous it would be. They were promised short service. Many believed the war would be over in months. They were wrong. On July 1861, Confederate and Union troops clashed at Bull Run in Virginia. At the time, the area was part of a larger region known as the Confederacy. But today, we know it as Manassas National Battlefield Park. Today, visitors can explore multiple battle sites and learn about the conflict through exhibits and ranger programs. The July day began like any other. Visitors strolled the grounds, picnicking and enjoying the summer weather. But that afternoon, the air grew thick with smoke and the sounds of battle. The first shots were fired, and with that, the tranquility of the day was shattered. For many Americans, the war was not just about maps and treaties, but about the dust, the heat, the long marches, and the friends left behind in shallow graves under foreign skies. For others, the war was about something else entirely, about freedom, about justice, about loyalty to a flag, to a president, to a state. It was personal. By 1861, the United States was no longer the fragile experiment it had been in Washington's day, but it was also no longer united. The question of slavery had been simmering for decades, and now it was boiling over. The war was unlike any America had fought before. It was not against a foreign enemy, but against itself. Families were torn apart, neighbors became enemies, and soldiers on both sides often spoke the same language, sang the same songs, and prayed to the same God. The first major clash came at Bull Run in Virginia on July 1861. Civilians from Washington rode out with picnic baskets to watch, expecting a quick Union victory. Instead, they saw chaos. Confederate forces under generals like Thomas Stonewall Jackson. The North learned a painful truth. The war would be long and bloody. The future of the United States was hanging in the balance. Over the next year, battles erupted from the Mississippi River to the Atlantic coast. At Shiloh, in 1862, Confederate and Union forces clashed in one of the bloodiest battles of the war. More than 23,000 men were killed or wounded in just 2 days. It was a grim preview of the slaughter to come. From the battlefields of Antietam to Fredericksburg, the war dragged on. And with each passing month, the toll on the soldiers grew heavier. It was not just the physical wounds, but the emotional scars that ran deeper. The war had become a crucible, testing not only the strength of the nation, but the character of its people. Today, visitors can explore parts of the battlefield where those pivotal moments unfolded. Walking among the trees, it's easy to imagine the smoke rising and the cannons roaring. More than 150 years later, the legacy of the Civil War continues to resonate. After the attack on Fort Sumter, Southerners rejoiced. But as the weeks turned into months and the fighting continued, a sense of unease began to creep in. They had anticipated a swift victory, but the war was shaping up to be a long one. At a tavern in Virginia, a group of men sat drinking and swapping stories of the war. One of them, a young private named John Mosby, sipped his beer and watched the others. They were a mix of farmers, shopkeepers, and artisans, all volunteers who had left their homes to fight for the Confederacy. Mosby himself had been working as a printer when the war began. But now he found himself on the front lines, facing an enemy that refused to give up. At first, we all thought it was a glorious thing, he recalled, and we went into it with a great deal of enthusiasm. But now that enthusiasm was starting to fade. "We are getting tired," one man said, "and this is going to be a long, hard winter." Another nodded his head. What started as excitement was turning into something much more complicated. "We are not fighting the British or the French," a third man added. "We are fighting our own countrymen. And I tell you, it is not a pleasant thing." They all knew that the war would change them forever. Some would return home, but they would carry the memories with them for the rest of their lives. Others would not be so lucky. Hey there, welcome to my channel. And today, we're going to look at the outcome of the American Civil War and how the United States was transformed by this horrific conflict. So let's start in Maryland, where on September 17, 1862, the two armies met near the town of Sharpsburg along Antietam Creek. Now the battle was fierce in the cornfield, the sunken road, and by Burnside's bridge. But by nightfall, more than 22,000 soldiers were dead, wounded, or missing. This would be the bloodiest single day in American history. In fact, the total number of casualties at Antietam made it the single deadliest battle in the Western Hemisphere until World War II's Battle of Iwo Jima, though tactically the battle was a draw. It was a strategic victory for the Union. You see, Confederate General Robert E. Lee had hoped to score a victory on Northern soil that would force President Abraham Lincoln out of office. But with his army depleted, Lee was forced to retreat to Virginia, and this gave Lincoln what he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation on January 1, 1863. In it, Lincoln declared that all enslaved people in territory held by the Confederacy were free. While it did not immediately free every enslaved person, it transformed the war into a fight not just for Union, but for human liberty. And once the proclamation was issued, African Americans began joining the Union Army in greater numbers. They served bravely in units like the 54th Massachusetts Regiment, which famously attacked Fort Wagner in July 1863. Two great Union victories changed the war's momentum. At Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, Union forces under General George Meade repelled Lee's second invasion of the North. The three-day battle ended with Pickett's Charge, a desperate Confederate assault that was cut down by withering fire. At the same time in the West, General Ulysses S. Grant captured the key city of Vicksburg, Mississippi, and with that, control of the Mississippi River. This victory split the Confederacy in two and gave the Union control of the Mississippi River. From there, Grant moved east to take command of all Union armies. By late 1864, Union General William Tecumseh Sherman embarked on a campaign to break the South's will to fight. His army marched from Atlanta to Savannah, Georgia, destroying railroads, factories, and crops along the way. Sherman's march to the sea was brutal, but it hastened the war's end. By spring 1865, Lee's army was exhausted, surrounded, and outnumbered. On April 9th, at Appomattox Courthouse, Virginia, Lee surrendered his army to Grant. In the aftermath of the Civil War, the United States was a very different place. Nearly 620,000 Americans had died, more than in any other war in American history. Towns mourned for generations. The scars, both physical and emotional, would shape the United States for the next century. For the soldiers, the war was mud and blood and endless marshes. It was the sound of cannon at dawn and the quiet grief of writing a last letter home by lamplight. Now, while this is just a brief overview of the outcome of the war, I do have some more detailed videos that go into much greater depth. So check out the link in the description if you want to learn more. Alright, now let's talk about how the Civil War started. If you want to learn more about the secession crisis, then click right here in this video and I will see you there.